So I hate when interviewers sometimes go back to something that you talked about like 20 minutes ago, but I have to make this comparison because you mentioned, and I forget where I've heard this, probably on one of the hundreds of documentaries about Tolkien, but you mentioned compartmentalizing and how, you were an academic, but you had, all these things that you sort of love to do in your free time, right? Which, not to say they weren't academic, but you were trying to fit them in. So I have to make a comparison to Tolkien about how, he was a linguist, right? And in his free time, he was making up made up languages, right? So have you ever thought about that? Like how he sort of, and he was a professor at Oxford, correct?
Yes.
Have you ever thought about that comparison at all?
Well, in some ways, I mean, one of the things that has become clearer and clearer to me with Tolkien, as I've been studying him more over the last few years and learning more and more through my podcast, it's clearer and clearer to me that Tolkien, some people talk about Tolkien's career, like his academic career. And, there were people, even in his own time, who were saying that he was kind of a disappointment, right? Disappointment because of his comparatively low scholarly output, right? I mean, he didn't publish all that much. And everyone knew that he was brilliant, right? I mean, he was like the great philologist and very, very great. Like, so people had been waiting. People waited his entire career, like, when is Professor Tolkien going to, publish like the next big definitive, treatise or textbook on philology that they were waiting for, and it didn't come, and it didn't come, and it never came. And then, of course, in the end, what comes is the Lord of the Rings, right? And Tolkien,
thankfully,
by that time is almost at retirement age, and the Lord of the Rings come to that, and then everyone's like, okay, so we see what you were doing instead of working, right? When you should have been, working on your philology, you were doing this instead. And that's always been kind of the perception, certainly from the academic side, that instead of doing his philology work, instead of doing his linguistic stuff, he was, writing these fantasy stories instead, as if like he was doing that in the closet as a kind of, shameful hobby, which happened to make it big, But as you say, you can already see in his invented languages, right, that the two things are not like unconnected at all, right? They're the opposite of unconnected. And this is the thing that has become clearer and clearer to me as I've been studying Tolkien, is the extent to which his creative work was not a distraction from his scholarship. His creative work was a manifestation of his scholarship. Like, they missed it. Like, what nobody saw, like what his colleagues at Oxford didn't see, is that in a very real sense, The Lord of the Rings was the big treatise and textbook that he never published, right? It wasn't just a distraction from it, right? It was the form in which his own scholarship took its clearest expression. Tolkien, he did not like, and frankly was not very good at writing critical stuff. I mean, the Monsters and the Critics, his famous Beowulf essay, is an excellent essay, though kind of wandering. Right? On fairy stories is incredible, though even more wandering. I mean, that essay is really fun. Considered only as a piece of, as a sample of scholarly writing, it's not a good model, right? I mean, like Tolkien fans, don't model your scholar, don't try to write papers like Tolkien wrote on fairy stories. It's not a good model. Right. And again, it's not where his heart was. It's not what he was good at, right? What he is good at is this, so writing about Beowulf was hard for him, right? But writing about the Rohirrim, not hard, right? And that's, and you can see it like more and more. Tom Shippey, of course, is wonderful about these things. That is like pointing out the places in The Lord of the Rings where Tolkien is actually making a critical argument, right? Implicitly in his, so like he clearly had a theory about what this one line in Beowulf, this one contested line in Beowulf meant, right? And there were all these scholarly debates about what, the person who said this thing in Beowulf meant when he said that thing, right? Well, Tolkien had a theory about that, so what does he do? He doesn't write an article on it, right? Debating with all those other people who are debating about this.
He writes mythology.
Yeah, he puts that line in Hama's mouth, right?
Yeah.
When Hama confronts Gandalf and Aragorn at the door, and shows clearly what he thinks that guy meant when he said that thing, right? Like what it translates to and what he meant by it.
Right.
And so again, it's not about competition with his scholarship. Like it is his scholarship. And of course, the invented languages are some of the purest instances of that. Because of course, this is another thing that you see, especially back in those earlier volumes of the history of Middle-earth, right? People talk about Tolkien's invented languages, and usually will refer to that and, you know, understand that it was really impressive what he did, right? The depth of the language, you know, the complexity of the languages that he created. But that's only like the surface. I mean, those are like stills compared to a film, right? Because what he was really doing when he was inventing his languages, and one of the reasons that there are so many different variants and changes and things, is that he wasn't just saying, I'm going to invent a language. Oh, hey, I'm going to invent another language. Instead, he was taking all of the things that from his philological work, right, about how languages change over time, right, the kind of external sociological and geographical factors that lead languages to change or to split, and then what kinds of factors will affect the two different languages that came off the same route to go in different ways. And then what happens when a branch of one of those two then comes back into contact with the other one?
The sundering of the elves, yeah.
Exactly. The sundering of the elves is exactly it, right? So all of these, so he's not just inventing a language, right? He invents the languages and their entire tree, right? The entire process of how those languages change and develop and become, 8 or 9 different languages, and the ways in which they interact, and how you can see the borrowings from this one language back into the other language. And I mean, it's this whole big, enormous, moving tapestry of language through all of this stuff, which is, as you say, this is the Silmarillion, right? This is the heart of what the Silmarillion stories are. And as soon as you see him talking about the languages themselves, you can hear all of the Silmarillion stories come from that. Yeah. Why do we have the Green Elves, right? Why do the Green Elves exist? We've got this, people complain about Silmarillion readers, especially like my old undergrads, used to complain all the time about how ridiculously overcomplicated the divisions of the elves are, right? Like, oh, how you've got, it's not enough to have, the Vanyar and the Noldor and the Teleri, right?
Yeah.
You've got to have the Teleri divided into, 5 different subgroups, which then change their name 4 times, and all this stuff. But there's explanations for each one of them.
And it's the first reading that it becomes problematic, right? It's not until you know these people, right? Yeah. And you know where they came from, and you know where they're going, and you know where their brother is, and that you really appreciate it. Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, all those things are Tolkien playing with. You can see all those things create a different linguistic situation.
Well, I think probably another thing having common is the desire to create. Right. Yes. And so I'm sure he was really good at a lot of things, but he had that part in him that just wanted to,
And that's what he loved most, and it really is what he was best at. I mean, there are mixed reports about his teaching. I mean, there are several people for whom he was the most influential teacher of their entire lives. W.H. Auden, the famous poet, of course, was very outspoken about this. He was an undergraduate student of Tolkien's, and was in touch with him throughout his life and everything. And there are some who were I couldn't understand a word that guy said, and it was super weird and boring. But teaching is not his heart. I don't think was ever really what he did love to share things with people, but classroom teaching did not seem to be where his heart really was. He's the heart of a poet. He is a creator. He's a sub-creator.
Yep.
This is what he does.
And you talked about that, I think, in I probably both session 1 and session 2 talked about how he was. I think it was session 2. You talked about how he's really kind of underrated at writing verse, right?
Yes.
So I'm just going to move us along here a little bit.
Sure.
I feel like you and I could just probably talk for a couple hours on this.
I think so.
But so you mentioned one of the first things that sort of led you to Tolkien. I'm trying to segue here. Was C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia. There was an NPC in my campaign called Taradon. He was a sage from the Second Age who kind of set all of these things in motion. He had studied the writings of Celebrimbor, and he had, in my campaign, because the architect is really not known, I said he was the architect of Orthanc, right? And we.
He was a Numenorean, this guy?
He was a Numenorean, yes. So he had a signet ring, and he had a shield that was in the shape of a diamond, and each of the points of the diamond had a sort of, it was like a formula, right? And the point I'm making is his signet ring and the symbol on the shield, in order to do the ritual that the characters would eventually discover, was a grand lion, and that was a reference to C.S. Lewis in our campaign. So, but speaking of Taradon, so the 4 points of the shield were that which escaped of the void, which was the black sword Angwarel. If you can remember the sister sword to
Eowl's sword, which was stolen by Maegwyn, right?
Yeah, and so when that sword was described as having come from the heavens, right? I think it actually means like fiery star, right? That or its sister sword, and so I took that literally to mean no, it came from the void. So in my campaign, I sort of tied it into that. There was a section.
So wait, so can I just ask? Does that?
Please.
Are you suggesting, therefore, that because of course the black metal, right, that Eowl makes, the unique black metal that Eowl forged out of this, like meteoric stone, right, and made into the two swords, right, Anglachel and Anguirel. So are you suggesting, therefore, that there is something, like, so the darkness of the blade reflects the void? Is there something intrinsically, like, evil about it? Is it dark in its nature?
Yeah, so as we know from the Silmarillion, right, and the Children of Húrin, the sword itself kind of has the maker's spirit in it, right? Like it, and so gladly I will drink thy blood, right, or whatever it says to turn. So there was a little bit of that. I was trying to sort of tie into that, but I also. When the characters do the ritual, yes, they open up a sort of a gateway to Tol Eressëa, but they also open this portal or this small door in the void, and that was kind of Sauron's way of introducing, even back in the First Age, a seed that would eventually lead to the big bad coming back, right? So
he's always trying to get Morgoth in through the back door, right? So
exactly.
That checks.
Yeah. That checks. Okay. Awesome. All right. So I'm kind of. I think we could probably start the game now, but I was kind of just giving you and sort of the listeners sort of background here. So the next point on it was that which burns inside of us all, and I mixed several things in the mythology, right? This concept of Ea. Right? The world that is created, the secret fire, the living stone that is talked about in Aqualunde, and so where I kind of took that from was the characters encounter an Arkenstone like gem.
Right.
Okay, and my theory for this was that the 7 dwarf kings awoke in different mountains. And so my take on this, you can see where this is going, is that when they woke up, a piece of that living stone, that Ea, this is where probably the definition of Ea is, I'm incorrect about this, but that the Arkenstone was really just a part of that sort of creation stone that Aule made for the 7. How do you think? How did I do there?
Okay. I agree. All right, let's see. I like the... first of all, I love the Arkenstone thing, right? Like, that's great. It's one of the... I can understand why Tolkien never talks about the Arkenstone in The Lord of the Rings. I mean, like, let's face it, it's not pertinent, right? So he doesn't go there. It doesn't come up. It's not relevant to The Lord of the Rings.
And he's already done the Silmarils, so...
Well, yeah, he kind of... So... Okay, let's see. Let me see how briefly I can do my Arkenstone explanation. In The Hobbit, he's recycling Silmarillion material, right? This is what's happening because The Hobbit is not designed to be part of the same world. It's a totally separate standalone. He's recycling stuff from all over these. He recycles stuff from Beowulf. He recycles stuff from Old Norse, like the trolls and the dwarves and their names and everything, right? He recycles things from bunches of different places. Again, Norse with Bjorn, right? So all kinds of things he's recycling, right? It's not just, they're not the same, they're not identical, but he's reusing them and adapting them into his story. And of course, he also reuses and adapts a bunch of stuff from his own stories, right? From his own mythology. And, one of some of the most important things among that are, things like the Elven King, who looks an awful lot like Thingol of Doriath. He's not Thingol, right? No wife, no daughter. He's not Thingol, but he looks exactly like, and, Mirkwood looks a lot like Doriath, except when it looks exactly like Tower Niflheim, right? So, he's recycling stuff all over the place. The Arkenstone is one of the most obvious things that he's recycled. The Arkenstone is clearly a recycled Silmaril. He uses almost the same language to describe it, and he really gives away the game when in one of the places which Christopher Tolkien publishes in, I think it's The Shaping of Middle-earth, when he publishes, because Tolkien being Tolkien, right, translated portions of the Silmarillion into Anglo-Saxon, like you do.
Of course, why not?
And when he translated the bits about the Silmarils, like the word Silmaril in Anglo-Saxon is Eorkenstana, like the Arkenstone is clearly a recycled Silmaril, but it's not a Silmaril, right? Like once he makes the connection, right? Once he decides, and he doesn't do this until he's like partway through the Fellowship of the Ring, when he decides, okay, the Lord of the Rings, which is the sequel to The Hobbit, this is all going to be the same world, right? It's going to be like that stuff is going to be, in fact, like that stuff, meaning the Silmarillion stuff, is all going to be the ancient history of this world, right? So no more recycling, it's now connected, right? And at that point, he drops the Arkenstone like a hot potato.
Yep.
Because, now the real Silmaril, so you can't so there's no place anymore for the recycled Silmaril. So he just kind of drops it, which means within the newly, much more fully imagined Middle-earth of the Lord of the Rings, Tolkien never explains the Arkenstone. So what was the Arkenstone then? It was, why do we, what, okay, it's not a Silmaril, but what was it? So anyway, so I love the fact that you have you're doing an explanation of that. The Arkenstone needs an explanation. It needs a history. It's so much more than just there was this one super awesome gem that they found in Erebor. It was more beautiful than any other gem. It's clearly more than that, right?
Right.
But what? So hey, that works. That works for me. But let's see a few. So Ea coincides with the secret fire in some sense, right? So when Iluvatar shows them the Ainur, that is them, shows them the vision, right? Behold your minstrelsy, right? Here's the music, and he says, I'm going to put the secret fire at the heart of the thing, and I'm going to call it Ea. So Ea is the world, creation, is Ea,
okay,
right? The world that is, right, is Ea, but the secret fire is at least sort of metaphorically, right, the creation power of Iluvatar. So here's the tricky thing. The question is, when thinking about the Arkenstone, so I love the concept of the coinciding of, the idea that the Arkenstone, so when the thing that I love most about your concept there is it's a concept when, if applied back to the text, actually gives this really cool new layer of meaning to the text, right? You think about Thorin talking about the stone of my fathers, and man, okay, if that stone was Durin's stone that Durin woke up with, then that's the stone of his fathers, and again, it makes me think of all those scenes at the gates of Erebor, right, in The Hobbit, and be okay, Thorin still a little bit,
a little crazy, but yeah,
there, right, still a little on the crazy side, but come on, you know, you can kind of see it.
And so what you just did is what I did, and I ended up the stone that they ended up finding, of course, was not the Arkenstone. It was the Durin stone. Except after I named it the Durin stone, I realized that there was already a Durin stone in the Mirror, right? So that's one of the things that I would have changed. I would have named it something different.
Right. Yeah, and it's a hard thing because we don't get so many other, like any other of the names of the 6 other fathers of the dwarves. So we kind of have Durin and a bunch of other folks. But anyway, so the one other thing I was going to say was, as far as Aule is concerned, right, the maker of the dwarves. So what the thing that he was incapable of doing, right, was exactly, he can make things, right? He can form things, but he can't create. The spark of life is what he can't give. So in a sense, the secret fire, right? The secret fire is the thing that Aule doesn't have access to. Right? And that's why, though he was capable of making dwarves, he could make the shape of them. He could even make them move. You know, like he could even make flesh, apparently. It's not like they were, I think, made out of stone golems or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. But what he couldn't do is give them souls, right? He couldn't make them autonomous. Only Iluvatar could do that. And so Iluvatar gives life to them. So here's what this is. So this is the one thing that I would want to think more about is those stones. If those stones are associated with the life of the dwarves in some way, would the stones have to be, therefore, also kind of a gift from Iluvatar, or sort of a reminder from Iluvatar, or would it be something that Aule made in honor of that? So the light in the stones, like the Arkenstone, it wouldn't actually be the secret fire, right? Maybe it's something sort of more commemorative, right? Where like he gives each of the dwarves a stone which contains this living light, right? Or what looks like living. It's not actually an independent soul, right? Because again, Aule can't do that, right? But he puts this living light inside the stone and gives them to each of the dwarf fathers as sort of a reminder, right? Of like the spark of life that Iluvatar breathed into them. So it's like a kind of remember where you came from. And because Aule would not want the dwarves just to be thinking of him as their father.
Sure.
Because he's chastised. He's humbled by the experience, and he's like, I blew it, right? So he's not going to want to repeat that by after Iluvatar gives the dwarf life, being like, oh yeah, so basically you guys should be all about me. Like, no, he's going to want to redirect their attention to Iluvatar. So the stones could be the mechanism by, a kind of reminder, right?
That's great. No, that's very good.
That's my suggestion for refining the Aule's involvement there.
I love it. If I ever turn this into fan fiction, I'm going to use that. I guess it already kind of is fan fiction.
It's just a different form, exactly.
So let's see. The third point was that which can see across the straight road, which is pretty obvious. It's the Elendil stone.
Stone, absolutely.
And so if you start piecing all of these things together, you can kind of see. Okay, so we have this mechanism to bridge the gap across the straight road. We have this secret fire thing that's going to be used to power this ritual, right? We have this thing that has come from the void. We're not really sure what's that doing in the ritual, which I'll get to in a little bit. And then the fourth point, and then this is the thing that the players struggled with the most guessing, that which has the greatest gift. Which is not an item at all, right?
Right.
And so the greatest gift, of course, is the ability to die and to pass pass on from the world. So the great altar that he built in Orthanc, that ritual needed to be done by a human.
Right. Okay.
Does that fit? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, and that's especially interesting in the context of you thinking about the dude, right? That is Taradon, the dude that who's behind all this stuff, right? Who, especially if he's a Númenorian in the Second Age, building a tower in Middle-earth, right? He's kind of in Elvish territory, right? I mean, he's not that far from, Holland would still be, this is obviously before the fall of Khazad-dûm and before the war with Sauron, and the making of the rings of power, right? So he would be not in elvish territory in the sense that he's surrounded by elves. I mean, there were other men, of course, that would have lived all around him there, but he would definitely have been kind of a human who was like deliberately walking in the footsteps, at least as far as lore and everything is concerned, of the elves. And so the idea of, though it's also a very kind of counterintuitive thing for a Númenórean to like be totally down with the gift of death. I'm not saying it's impossible. I think it's interesting, actually. And of course, given that this Númenórean figure that you've invented, Taradon, has also obviously separated himself from the rest of Númenor, right? I mean, he's left Númenor and he's moved back to Middle-earth, and not just hanging out in the coastal enclaves, right? But he's way inland. I mean, he's doing his own thing, right? And so therefore, thinking that he has in some way differentiated himself from the rest of the Númenóreans makes sense, right? I mean, that seems to work.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because he wasn't totally cool. I mean, the whole concept of Taradon's wager is to get closer to Valinor, right? Is to travel across the straight road. So we still have that Númenórean thing going on, right?
Okay.